Hello, everyone, and welcome to another community conversation on the health crisis in
of personnel.
That's a great
Another
question,
element
and I would
is
recommend to
We're thinking outside the box, trying to come up with new ways of
as
moving.
you already mentioned, the city is
Let's try to keep these numbers from doubling.
At over 33%.
It's really important. I'm glad. I hope you're watching at home.
First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to the show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Facebook Live. It's Friday at noon. I'm Mayor Eric Pappenfuss, and today's community conversation is on the budget and all things financial for the city of Harrisburg. But before you scroll away and decide to watch a cat video, I have to tell you that we are going to make this accessible, interesting, and fun. So don't leave the live stream. We are joined today by City's financial advisor, Dan Connolly, who's zooming to us. Where are you, Dan, at the moment?
I'm in the city of Philadelphia.
From the city of Philadelphia, and we're gonna talk about his role with the city. But before we get to that, I want to begin with a handful of announcements, and we'll start with the most sobering of them, as we have every week now for the past months, and that's the latest Biobot data for the city of Harrisburg. If you look at the data, the thing which strikes me about it, and Moment, do you have the graph this week to be able to bring up on the screen? Okay. If you look at the spiking graph, you'll see in the dark line that the virus concentration is exceeding even the rolling average of the new cases in the county, and that's been pretty consistent all the way back. And that's partly because the virus is predictive of what the case count is going to be. People may not even know they have it, and they have it, and that's showing up in the testing. It's showing that it's going to get worse, and that's the main takeaway from that graph. And worse also within the context of it never having been this bad before. You have to go way back. And if you think about where we were even a month ago, we are just so much worse off than we were a month ago. We're beginning to see that little post-Thanksgiving spike, which I think people feared and predicted. And that's what you see in the graph, and that's what you're going to see in the testing results in the week to come. On the second page, when they talk about the normalized virus concentration in relation to the other sample cities, Harrisburg continues to be off the charts as well. We have a higher concentration in Harrisburg than 91% of all the municipalities that Biobot tests, hundreds of them throughout the country. So that is sobering. I don't know where Philadelphia is in this, Dan, but Harrisburg is off the charts. And we have what they are predicting from the data is a 13% incidence rate, which means about 170 new cases a day, and 13% of the population is estimated right now in the Harrisburg metropolitan area to be carrying COVID. 1 out of 10 people that you see on the streets. And this is why we have got to be incredibly cautious. We've got to continue to maintain social distancing, continue to wear masks, continue to do smart things, not spend a lot of time indoors with recycled air, continue to telecommute when at all possible, continue to be outside as much as possible. And it's getting harder and harder to do that as the weather gets cooler and cooler. It's getting to the point where I can tell you from an operational standpoint at the city, we're starting to see people in all departments having to quarantine, in part because a loved one or a family member has come in contact with COVID. And when the percentages are that high in the community, it is almost inevitable. So unfortunately, the message is things are going to get worse before they get better. We have to continue to be smart. We have to continue to take this very, very seriously. And that is the scientific data from Harrisburg for this week. In terms of other general announcements, I want to let people know, because we've had some questions about this, leaf collection is continuing and will continue all the way through January 1. The only thing that's going to stop it at this point is a significant snowstorm or snow accumulation. When that happens, we suspend leaf collection, and our public works team are really pretty much focusing on snow removal during those times. Remember, you leave your yard waste and leaves out on the street sweeping. nights and in the street sweeping locations, not with your trash. It's a different group that comes and collects those leaves and those clippings. But that will continue until we have our first major snowfall, or at least till January 1st, depending on which comes first, snow or January 1st. Hard to say at this point. Also wanted to remind everyone, we had a great show last week for Black Friday and Small Business Saturday, and we talked a little bit about the opening of the new Neighborhood Business Stabilization Fund Round 2 and the grants that were available now for small businesses in Harrisburg. I know that a lot of people have made their way over to the Harrisburg Regional Chamber website. That's harrisburgregionalchamber.org. And they have gotten the information to apply for that grant. But I know there's also still time to do so. So if you know a small business that is struggling due to the impact of COVID, which is almost every business, you need to help make them aware of this grant program as opening again. So send them to the Harrisburg Regional Chamber website, check it out yourself, get the information, spread the word. Hopefully every business that applied last time will apply again, plus a lot of businesses that may have missed out on the first round will not miss out on the second round. And I'm sort of talking about this every chance I get, but you and the community could help by spreading the word. So go to harrisburgregionalchamber.org. This is the same program that last time we partnered with Impact Harrisburg to do. The qualifications are a little bit different this time because we're using federal CDBG community block grant dollars, but it still could be a lifesaver to help some small businesses make it through the winter. So check out the requirements and all the other information at the harrisburgregionalchamber.org website. Also regarding businesses, there is still time to sign up for our upcoming December 8th virtual workshop, which is going to be presented by Google in conjunction with our Director of Business Development, who you met on last week's show, Mr. Jamal Jones. And the topic of that is how to get your business to show up on all those Google searches and maps, and maybe how to change that data if you change. And it's important stuff. And you can register right now for that workshop if you go to harrisburgpa.gov/workshops. Okay, harrisburgpa.gov/workshops. And again, that's coming up on December 8th. Also on December 8th, and December 9th will be the City Council budget hearings. Those will be on our YouTube platform, and you can send comments to our public comment email if you have comments or questions about the budget. And that's heading to a vote, which is scheduled currently for December 10th. So a lot is going to happen on the budget next week. If you haven't seen the budget, or you haven't seen my PowerPoint on the budget, you can watch the video of the PowerPoint, I think here on our Facebook feed or on the city website. You can also get the PowerPoint and the budget off the city website, harrisburgpa.gov. And we would welcome your questions and comments. We'd welcome them today, so please send them in as I'm having a conversation here with Dan Connolly, but we'd also welcome them during the hearings. And you might have specific questions for department heads, and all of our department heads will be there over the course of the hearings on the 8th and the 9th. These usually last a few hours. They're long. I don't have the schedule yet because council will set that, so I don't know if police is on night 1 or night 2, for instance. But the 8th and the 9th is coming up, and I hope you join us for those. Also, a little bit of positive news. You know, we had I thought, a very successful and pretty fun reverse parade for the holidays. We're trying things differently during these difficult times, and rather than doing traditional New Year's Eve this year, we're just not going to gather in the close confines of 2nd Street and watch the fireworks and the strawberry drop. We're not going to do that. We are, however, going to have a virtual celebration, and we've got a fun thing for families and kids, which is that we're encouraging people to do their own sort of at-home balloon drop. And you can go to harrisburgpa.gov/NYE for New Year's Eve, harrisburgpa.gov/NYE, to reserve your own balloon drop kit. That's right. Have a little fun on New Year's Eve. And you can reserve it. You can schedule a pickup time, and you can do this anytime up to Monday, December 14th. It's obviously free. You can get some, just a fun packet of stuff. And then, in addition to that, we're encouraging people to maybe share their photos or their messages of past New Year's Eves and send them also to us. You can submit them online, also at harrisburgpa.gov/NYE, so that we can put together what will be a virtual countdown, and will feature all sorts of iconic Harrisburg locations and businesses, and maybe your photos, which I think will be fun. So something to watch as a sort of local feed for New Year's Eve. We're gonna celebrate the new year, and I think there will be many people cheering to see an end to 2020 and a new beginning, hopefully in 2021. So, but it will all be virtual this year. It'll all be online. And finally, a push. Please consider shopping local for the holidays. I know it's hard for some people like myself to believe we are getting very close to the holidays, and they're almost upon us. I've done very little shopping, and it would be helpful, but it's also very true that we've got a lot of local restaurants and businesses that have all sorts of holiday specials and sales, and you can support them, and you can get all your shopping done pretty easily if you take a look. So you can find more information about local holiday specials and types of things at Explore HBG. And I hope you'll check that out. And you can also check in with Jamal Jones and our business development folks at the city for a list of our Shop Local participants. So that is the message. Those are the announcements for today. And let's get to the meat of the conversation. And let's be joined now by Mr. Dan Connolly. And Dan, I described you as the financial advisor for the city, and I think we should start with a little bit of background about who you are and how you came to be a financial advisor, and then what is a financial advisor, just to start with. So, welcome to the show, Dan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I work for a firm called Marathon Capital Strategies. We are a municipal advisor, which means we advise municipalities and other tax-exempt entities like healthcare systems, senior living systems on municipal debt issuance and capital planning. I've been in this line of work for about 15 years. Municipal advisors are independent. We are regulated by the federal government, the SEC, and we have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of our clients, whereas sometimes a municipality might hire a broker-dealer that is selling a certain product. They don't have the same responsibility as we do as a fiduciary. That is not to say that they don't act ethically, but we have a special fiduciary duty to our clients.
I think that's a really important point, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to go out and hire you. And when we did hire you, I should note we did a pretty extensive search. We had an RFP process. We interviewed a lot of firms, and you were selected after a pretty rigorous review, because we wanted to have that sort of independent voice with that type of fiduciary responsibility. I'll say, you don't have to say it, but I'll say that Harrisburg historically, and one of the reasons that we ended up in the debt crisis that we did, had a lot of financial advisors that basically were paid based on the deals. And if you look at the structuring of a lot of the deals that eventually brought Harrisburg to the brink of bankruptcy, many of them were generated with almost the sole purpose of generating fees to the professionals that were advising that these projects be done. For instance, they'd enter into a swap deal or something regarding the school district, but the real reason would be to generate fees, which would then go into pay individuals, but it would also go into the general fund to purchase artifacts and other ulterior motives. So we knew that to get the city back on track, we needed to have somebody with an independent fiduciary responsibility and not somebody who would be paid by the deal. And just so the public understands, you're not paid by the deal. You're paid just a straightforward hourly rate based on the amount of time and work you put in and do for the city. But talk about just a little bit more about that fiduciary responsibility. What does it mean to you, and what type of confidence can the public take in you saying I have an independent, fiduciary responsibility?
In the simplest terms, is that I am required by law to act in the city of Harrisburg's best interest. We do not have a particular structure or product to push. We do not have a vested interest in any particular plan of finance for the city that is related to our compensation. Our sole interest is representing what's best for the city of Harrisburg, giving our outside third-party perspective and making advice based on that independence.
Right. You're going to get paid the same amount regardless of whether or not the financial plan passes or the budget passes or whether or not we do a restructuring or we don't do a restructuring. You're giving the best advice you can, and it's really up to us as elected officials and the community as those that empower the elected officials to ultimately make the decisions. But you're giving us the facts and the information that we need to be able to make those decisions wisely. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today. We're going to talk about city's extraordinary taxing power and the breaking news there, the impact of COVID, the goals of the budget, all sorts of things that are debt load, restructuring opportunities. And I know you've got a number of slides. They're pretty straightforward. But let's bring up the first one, and let me start by having you sort of walk through the summary, and then I'll ask you some questions about that.
Sure. Moving after the title slide there. Just to highlight at a pretty high level, a few things that I think Harrisburg residents should take away from the budget is that there have been significant steps in recent days, literally, that is putting the city in position to emerge from fiscal distress and secure its financial future. What I'm speaking about specifically is the extension of the city's special taxing powers, which the city had under its distressed municipality status in Pennsylvania's Act 47 program. The program allowed the city to raise rates above limits otherwise allowed by law, and that generated a good bit of operating revenue for the city, about 20% of the operating revenue. But the city was not going to have those taxing powers indefinitely. And the major question was, what would happen when you couldn't generate 20% of the revenue you needed to provide services? And that was a major challenge. The extension of the powers not only secures or helps to secure long-term structural budgetary balance, but it also likely paves the way to explore refinancing the city's high interest rate debt. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from this year's budget and recent budget developments. The 2021 budget itself was developed in the context of COVID and the pandemic pressures that you just alluded to at the beginning of the show. A lot of municipalities are dealing with that slowdown in economic activity. But despite those challenges, the city is still able to prioritize services, investing in capital needs, and paying down debt. Finally, as we'll see in the forthcoming slides, the budget does include a very large transfer of fund balance to accomplish some of these goals. So in the near term, there's a reduction in fund balance. But the budget itself was developed in the context of a multi-year perspective and securing balanced budgets going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. And that's a lot of that. That may seem like a lot of information, and so we're going to go slow and sort of break some of this stuff down, and let's try and put it into basic terms that I think the average viewer can understand. Let's talk, we'll go next to the first slide, and we'll talk about the extension of the taxing powers. Now, this is what has been in the news very recently. It was an extraordinary accomplishment for the city. We actually got bipartisan support, Republicans as well, allowing us to maintain our taxing authority for the long term, pushing it out for 10, 15 years and beyond, which is pretty remarkable. I want to note a couple things for this context. Nothing is changing in terms of what people are currently paying. We haven't raised taxes in the city. We don't plan to, but we had a situation where there was going to be a time where these taxes expired, and that was beyond our control prior to the legislature's new law. The way I would describe it is, imagine if you had a job and your family was scraping by. You were able to pay all the bills, but you knew that in a year or two you were going to lose that job. And you wanted to go to a bank, and you'd go to a bank and you'd say, I'd like to refinance my home, or borrow some money, or take out a loan for some purpose or another. And the bank would say, well, and you show the bank your financial credentials, and they can see, oh, you're paying all your bills, you look like you're in a decent position, but I'm concerned about where you're going to be in 2 or 3 years. You're going to be losing your job. How do you what's your plan? How can you make that up? And that uncertainty and that sort of cloud hanging over the city's head was really negatively affecting our ability to borrow, to do long-term planning. Imagine if you wanted to make any of those purchases yourself and you knew you were going to be out of a job in a short period of time. It would be very difficult to be able to pay any of those off. So the extension of the special taxing power was basically a lifeline for the future that doesn't affect the amount of money that's coming in the short term, but make sure that it doesn't disappear. So that's the big picture that I would say, Dan. But why don't you walk through the specifics of exactly what it means to the city?
Sure. But the specific taxing powers related to the earned income tax, which is a wage tax that all residents pay on the money that they earn, and the local services tax, which is a head tax that workers, anybody who works in Harrisburg, whether they live in Harrisburg or not, pay. The earned income tax that was special to Act 47 municipalities or the city of Harrisburg under Act 47 generated about $8.2 million in 2020. The local services tax generated about $4.2 million. So over $12 million just in 2020 alone. And if you look out in the out years, you would expect that to grow. So, going forward, it's a $12 to $13 million budget problem that the city was going to be looking at. And as you were just describing, when that goes away, what do you do? Well, there aren't too many tools in your toolbox to cover a 20% hit to your operating budget. And the cuts would have been draconian. It would have been devastating to city services. So what the change in the fiscal code at the state level did was extend those EIT taxing powers indefinitely. So the $8.2 million and growing each year will be restored and be retained. And the local services tax will be there in full for another 10 years. And then the city will retain half of the benefit for 5 years following.
Right. So, in some respects, Republicans could argue, and they did argue that what they actually did was they put a expiration date on the local services tax, but they pushed it out so far that it is really beyond a lot of the bills that we've currently accumulated, and it takes us to a whole nother. I mean, they pushed it out really a generation, and that is going to be exactly what we need to continue paying off Harrisburg's debt. Again, I want to emphasize no taxes are going up, and this wasn't something that was affecting us this year or next year, but this was this cloud that was hanging over us and making it hard for financial institutions to look at the city or take the city's planning seriously, because there was, prior to this extension, sort of an expiration date. But let's put this in the context of, we talk about the earned income tax and the local services tax. These are very important revenues to the city, and I think you described them. The earned income tax is basically an income tax, but it's paid by people who live in the city of Harrisburg. And the local services tax is sort of an impact fee, a one-time fee, the cost of a cup of coffee a week for people that work in the city, and they have to earn over a certain threshold. So it's really only paid by those that make a sustaining wage. So they have to work in the city and make a sustaining wage, and they pay essentially a cup of coffee a week. These taxes are important because those are an area where the city is seeing revenue growth, or had been seeing revenue growth over the past several years. The earned income tax was going up. The local services tax was going up. Why? Because more people were working in the city, and more people were earning more income. And I say were because everything sort of ground to froze in March of this past year with COVID. But as you look at it over the past 5 years, that's where we were seeing the growth. The other major income for the city from a revenue standpoint is property taxes. And property taxes was an area where we weren't seeing a lot of growth. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Dan. We already have a high millage rate on our property taxes. It's nothing compared to what the school district does on property taxes. But talk about the importance of the earned income tax and local services tax in terms of the growth of potential revenues for the city vis-a-vis property taxes and maybe other income sources.
Sure. Well, like you said, if you have growth in the city and you continue to make it a desirable place to work and live, and you see wage growth, with the same rate, you'll see a natural growth in the earned income tax for sure. And as you generate more jobs and workers, the local services tax revenues, collections will go up as well. The property taxes are a function of assessments and the level of collection rates that you're able to generate from the people who are paying those taxes. There's already a high real estate tax burden on the Harrisburg residents, and generating the growth in that source without increasing the rate is difficult. It lags because the assessments lag. And so when you're talking about achieving structural budgetary balance, that is, when I say structural budgetary balance, that is on a multi-year perspective, the rate of revenues will go up at the same pace as expenses. It is very difficult to have a heavy reliance on real estate taxes. So without the extension of the EIT and the LST, you would have been very, very reliant on the real estate taxes, and it would have been a challenge for the city.
Yeah, I think you've done a good job of explaining that. Basically, real estate taxes are flat, and the converse of this is that they haven't really been impacted by COVID either. They, at least in terms of the assessed rates, and maybe people's ability to pay has slightly, but real estate taxes are very, very stable. And it was not going to be an area where we were going to see growth because, in part, the city can't afford to raise the millage rate. It would be counterproductive. And it's already very high. And the school district already, through just the fact that in Pennsylvania, that's how we choose to fund our school districts, is constantly raising their millage rate, and so our tax base just can't afford a property tax hike. I'll note that the original recovery plan for the city of Harrisburg, which is was essentially abandoned in favor of this strategy of legislative change, which has been successful now with the extension of the taxing authority. The original recovery plan for the city, as developed by DCD, was to simply double the property tax, in part, to be fair to them, because if you didn't have an extension of the EIT and the local services tax, there'd really be no other option for the city, because our revenue sources are limited by the state, and property tax is really the only other option. They could have raised the significant money to fill that gap, but as a city, we felt that was never a viable option. We never approved that recovery plan, and we have always pushed for the legislative change that we got. I want to take a minute before we get to your next slide, though, Dan, to talk a little bit about the differences between the city of Harrisburg and the Commonwealth, and maybe the city of Harrisburg and other cities vis-a-vis the impact of COVID, in part because of exactly what we're talking about, the revenue structure and how revenues come into the city. And I brought, if you guys can see me at home, I brought the New York Times today, because I know that people, are reading the paper every day, and they're seeing things like the lead in today's paper, "State Politics Can't Stave Off Budget Anxiety." And people are reading that everywhere throughout the country, cities and municipalities are desperate. They're desperate for additional subsidies from the federal government, and many cities are having trouble balancing their budget in light of COVID. And COVID's impact is real, and we will talk about it, but the impact on the city of Harrisburg is really nothing like the impact on, for instance, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in part because when you think about it, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is reliant on sales tax and income tax. And sales tax has been deeply affected, as commerce has been affected by this crisis, as has incomes in a macro way. But the city doesn't have a sales tax. There's a mercantile tax, but it doesn't raise that much money vis-a-vis the others. It also lags a bit behind in terms of how businesses report. And if you think about the earned income tax, which we just described as being paid for by city residents, that's actually relatively stable in light of COVID in Harrisburg, because when you think about it, our largest employers are what? They are the Commonwealth, which has not seen widespread layoffs. And our largest private employer is a hospital system, a healthcare system, which is actually one of the major industries, which is, for better or for worse, booming in the current pandemic. We also have, if you look at who works in the city of Harrisburg and who's actually paying these taxes, large numbers of what I will call professionals, financial professionals, bankers, lawyers, lobbyists, others that are basically part of being a capital city. And those are the very industries that, for the most part, have been able to shift to remote online work, but they haven't stopped working. So I can tell you, there are lawyers that work in law firms in the city that haven't been into the office maybe since March, but they've been working and building up those billable hours over Zoom. So we're not seeing the same impact that other cities would if they were more dependent on things like tourism. Imagine, if you had Hershey Park in your municipality, and that was bringing in the bulk of your income. Or imagine if if your primary employer were different parts of the business sector, which were deeply affected by COVID, or if you were the state and you were reliant on sales taxes. We've already talked about property taxes being relatively stable, and that makes up the single largest portion of the city's income. So this is not to say that the effects of COVID aren't real, but you have to see them within the context of Harrisburg's Harrisburg's specific story, and it is different. It is simply different than other municipalities in Pennsylvania, and it's different than the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So take us through your next slide, which talks a little bit about the impact of COVID, and we'll drill down on that a little bit, because there are some specific areas where we are really feeling that impact, and I'll let you walk us through those, Dan.
Sure. All right. As you mentioned, the city has a relatively diversified set of tax streams. Some have been more affected by COVID than others. Because the city is a state capital, it's insulated from the impacts a little bit differently than other municipalities might be. Nevertheless, the city is projecting about almost $5 million less in 2020 revenues than 2019. The city did benefit from some CARES Act relief that was distributed through Dauphin County, not insignificant, $2.8 million. Like other municipalities, the city saw a lot of these challenges coming as soon as the local economy started to had to shut down, and did take corrective actions which minimized the budget damage. And the city is looking at a modest recovery in 2021. We are, from a multi-year financial planning perspective, despite some of the things that are insulating the city from the worst of the COVID impacts, we're still trying to maintain a relatively conservative revenue approach, and saying we're not going to, the city will not be returning to revenue levels from 2019, pre-COVID levels, until 2024 or so.
Let me pause you, Dan, if I can, just at that moment, and put that in the sort of bigger picture too, so that people can understand before we talk about some of the sensitive areas which have been really impacted by COVID. I think the takeaways from what you were just saying are that yes, we did see and we are anticipating about $5 million less in revenue in this year than what happened in 2019. But with the Federal CARES Act money, which was $2.8 million, we were able to close that gap, and that money was essentially a reimbursement to the city. It came through the county, and it was we literally showed our expenses, and then those expenses got reimbursed to $2.8 million. So we essentially had $2.8 million of those expenses covered. Between that and the fact that we then underspent our budget, we were able to not have a deficit. We will not have a deficit in terms of revenue versus expenditures for 2020. I think that is important for people to understand, because we did have some controls that we could in place. I mean, we've been experiencing this since March. We've taken a very careful approach to expenditures. Some of the things that we did were we had a hiring freeze for a period of time at the city, which just made sense because people couldn't, we would close City Hall. There were, a limit to bringing on new people anyway from a practical sense. But that was a savings that saved hundreds of thousands of dollars. We were able to not spend on certain projects. You save money by not opening the pools or not having certain summer programming when those things happen. So that was a budget savings. And, all of that put together meant that actually we were able to grow our fund balance slightly by saving a little bit more money than we were spending, even amidst a pandemic. I know that is hard for people to understand, or it's counterintuitive when you read headlines like you saw in the New York Times. But that is the reality of how we've managed the budget over the past year. So we escaped 2020 relatively unscathed. And that is not to say, however, that we're through the woods, because 2021 is going to be a rough year. But as we make these projections, now we are cognizant. We know how things have performed in over the past year. We know we're not being overly aggressive, and our revenue forecasts are taking into account the impact of COVID on the major four areas, which you can talk about now. So let's talk about the four that you highlight there. Why they were particularly susceptible to COVID, and how we are projecting them and taking those projections into account moving forward.
Sure. Well, the four that I've highlighted there, like the slide says, are particularly sensitive to COVID, and parking revenues was one of the hardest hit ones in 2020, about $2.5 million or so less than was budgeted. The city generates parking revenue from parking taxes and also other activity that's part of residuals from a parking asset sale some years ago. And what drives the parking revenue is parking activity. Parking activity has been down in the city, so revenue has been down. We're projecting 2021 not to be as bad as 2020, where things ground to a halt for weeks. But we're clearly not projecting or budgeting a return to quote unquote normal or pre-COVID levels. Earned income.
If we could, let's pause after each one of those. I think it's important that the public really sort of understands what we mean. So by parking revenues, we're talking about largely two different things. We're talking about the parking tax revenue, which is paid by people who park or operate parking lots or garages in the city of Harrisburg, and that revenue is expected to not continue to rise in the way that it had been rising pre-COVID, but it's actually still a significant number, and it is not to be confused with the other parking revenue, which is the money that was potentially going to come to the city through the parking system transaction, through what they called a waterfall, or it's sometimes called a lease payment. I want to remind folks, however, that although we don't get a sort of bonus money because the parking system is not making a profit, we are not on the hook for the covering of their bonds or their debt. And one of the things which the city's original recovery plan did, which in retrospect is part of the reason that we're able to weather this storm, is that we took the parking debt, not let alone the incinerator debt, which we also took off the city's books. And we're going to talk about the city's debt here in a minute, and you can walk us through what's left. But it's no longer the parking bonds or the incinerator bonds, which were hundreds of millions of dollars. And we got out of the parking business. Yes, we're a partner, and we make some revenue if they do well. But if they don't do well, the bonds are actually covered by Dauphin County and by Assured Guarantee. And over the past year, as the system hasn't made any money, they've had to call on the county and they've had to call on Assured to make up the difference. And that will continue if it happens. The city taxpayers are not on the hook for those bonds that were issued. So while we're not counting on extra revenue, and in fact, we budget zero for next year in terms of what we're anticipating coming in through the waterfall. At least we are not having to cover, hundreds of millions of dollars in parking bonds, which we would have had we still been in the parking business, which we were prior to the parking system. I hope that's clear for people, because the parking system gets a lot of complaint, and there's a lot of frustration in Harrisburg. And yes, we have to pay $3 an hour to park at the meters. But the city was on the brink of bankruptcy before in our history because we had hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds that we couldn't pay. And that is not going to be the case now, even with a prolonged COVID shutdown with the parking system, because we are not the guarantor. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on parking revenue, but you're happy to, and then we can talk about earned income.
Moved on to earned income. As you were describing previously, earned income tax revenue isn't the same as real estate tax revenue, which is going to be pretty stable. Earned income tax revenue will be driven by employment-related activity. And there has been a decline in the city, just like most other places. When the city was looking at these revenues in the middle of the year, it looked a whole lot worse than it is right now. There has been a faster recovery. We'll see, the whole world will continue to watch to see how the pace of the recovery continues. But because there are obvious employment and wage implications for COVID-related restrictions, it's a revenue source that the city is particularly has their eye on.
Yeah, and I'll just say again that it is not as bad as it could be, in part because you haven't seen a massive state layoff as our overwhelmingly largest employer. And again, with the hospital system being the largest private employer, you've seen growth in that sector, and most of the professional sectors are not ones that are immediately impacted. So when you talk about the earned income tax, it really varies on a case-by-case basis depending on what municipality you're talking about. So, but we project a decline and a slow recovery of their income tax. There is nothing aggressive about our projections there. The one I'm most concerned about is the business privileges tax, and you can talk a little bit about that, Dan, because that is the tax that businesses pay, and we know how hard hit our businesses have been in the city and elsewhere. But in Harrisburg, it's not a huge amount of money. You want to talk about the amount of the business privileges tax vis-a-vis these other revenue sources?
The business privileges tax, it doesn't even amount to half of the EIT, but it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's not a main revenue driver for the city's revenue structure. What's particularly mindful about the BPT is municipalities are not going to feel the full impact of the decline in PPT business activity and PPT collections until next year. That's because most businesses file on an annual basis and they pay in April. You receive collections, and you'll receive collections in 2021 based on activity in 2020. The city is budgeting almost a 20% reduction in BPT for 2021 compared to 2020. So that is one that we'll see. The city is expecting to see a pretty big reduction. The reduction wouldn't have the same percentage increase as, say, a reduction in earned income tax.
Okay, and let's go on to the hotel tax. Also, not a large number, but obviously an industry which has been very negatively impacted by COVID.
Exactly. Again, a hotel tax driven by um, uh, hotel-related activities during COVID. Uh, Conventions were stopped. The people weren't staying in hotels. So normally the city budgets $900,000 for this revenue source. For next year, I think the exact amount the city's budgeting is around 450,000, about half of normal.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good survey, and hopefully people understand that a little bit better about the city. Now, one of the reasons, though, that we're able to weather the storm, and maybe the thing that I'm most proud of in terms of what we've accomplished over the past 7 years, has to do with what we call our fund balance position. And I think the way to describe this is we have a savings account, and we've got some money in the bank. So, like other families, we may be struggling to pay the bills based on the revenues that are coming in, and we may have some unanticipated costs, but we've got a pretty strong savings account, and we've built that up every year now for the past 7 years. And when I came into office, we had nothing in the bank. In fact, we had a big stack of bills on the desk, some of which were a year or two old and that hadn't been paid. So we had to not only first pay all the bills, but then build up the savings account. And it's a pretty astounding number at the moment. Dan, why don't you talk about what that number is, and maybe you can talk a little bit too about how unusual it is to have that high a number if you're a third-class city in Pennsylvania or a municipality in Pennsylvania.
The city is projects to have at least $25 million in fund balance, likely higher than that. There's been revenues in the last couple of months that have not dropped off as the city was projecting over the summer, as available fund balance for general fund purposes at the end of the year. The operating budget is about 65 million. The base operating revenues are about 65 million a year. So on a percentage basis, that's a very high percentage of fund balance as a percentage of revenues. The city's fund balance policy is for 5% to maintain a fund balance level that equals 5% of operating expenses. $25 million blows that out of the water. It's over 30% of those expenses. Do you want to stop there, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, that's right. And so, as you're about to say, we think it's appropriate and prudent to draw down on that and to spend some of it. Some of it is going to have an added impact because we're going to be able to reduce debt. Some of it is going to go to fund some infrastructure projects, which I know everyone wants to see. And another portion of it is going to go for our public safety initiatives. And viewers of this show know that those public safety initiatives are not emerging out of a vacuum. As I heard the ICA say at their meeting this week, they didn't understand where did all this come from. It wasn't in the plan a year ago. Almost as if they'd missed the news of the past year, which has been almost 100% from a community engagement standpoint about public safety and about how we need to be part of a larger national movement to focus on changing the way policing and community relations works. And we're not going to get into that today as a policy initiative, but I would encourage people to tune into the budget hearings, maybe review our community policing show that we did a couple weeks ago where we talked about some of these initiatives. But it's dozens of new positions. It's a couple $1 million in overall investment. and it's really the major part of the budget proposal. But all of that is doable because of the fund balance, and all of that is doable, and we'll still have a large fund balance at the end of over $10 million, which again is still far more than we're required to have, and that is good news. But I don't want to take too much more time before we get to questions, Dan. So I think we need to talk about debt restructuring, and this is really, I think, your forte, and we owe you a real debt of gratitude because the focus, one of the focuses of this drawdown on the fund balance is how we can strategically deploy those funds in a way that is going to help us long term, and as part of not just a 5-year strategy, but a forward-looking strategy to deal with debt. And as we talked before, we had a lot of debt when we were on the brink of bankruptcy. We got rid of much of that debt, the parking authority debt, the incinerator debt, the real causes. But we were left with other types of debt. And maybe you can walk us through those types of debt and what's left, and how we hope to really seize an opportunity to restructure those debts as a key to our budget sustainability long term.
Sure. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? This slide highlights, there are two kind of higher level bullets, but it's really 3 pieces of debt. Way back in 1997, the city issued general obligation debt. That debt was insured by a company named called AMBAC. Bond insurance means that if the city paid a fee for a company to provide insurance, and that means if the city wasn't able to make principal or interest payments on that debt, a bond insurer would come in and make those payments. The reason why a municipality would do that is because if a bondholder knows that somebody's standing behind you to make those payments, they'll give you a better interest rate. Lo and behold, in 2012, the city did default on those bonds, and AMBAC did have to make payments of principal and interest. What happens isn't that they make those payments of principal and interest and then they go away. That principal and interest does have to be repaid. The city and AMBAC entered into an agreement that called for the repayment of those principal and interest payments to AMBAC. Those debt service payments have accumulated to almost $25 million now, which is what we refer to as forbearance liability.
I'll pause you there for a second, Dan, because that was a lot. And I think so first let's talk about, general obligation debt. And general obligation debt is essentially the way most cities function to capitalize and do infrastructure projects. You would issue a bond, you would have money released, you'd do a project, you'd pay it back over time. That's called general obligation debt. And for the city of Harrisburg, we're pretty fortunate because the remainder of that debt, that again goes back to 1997, is going to be finished in 2022. So we have only on that initial obligation just 2 more years of debt payments. And we have been making those debt payments every year that I've been in office, and paying it off at a rapid clip. And that is by far the largest amount of debt. What is our GO debt payment for next year? About
8.6 million.
Yeah. So more than the entire earned income tax, right, is going just to our general obligation debt. That's going to be done in 2 years, which is another reason why sort of extending the taxing authority beyond that is going to give us a real opportunity to grow our fund balance again, and to be in a position to eventually responsibly borrow. But the other aspect of it is I described how when we took office, there we had a pile of debts, of bills on the desk. We had all these obligations that we couldn't fulfill. Well, we reached an agreement under receivership before I came in office to basically, when we did default on the bonds, to not pay that back until after 2022, when the general obligation debt was done. This was done to sort of give the city time to get its financial house in order and then begin making those payments. It came at a pretty high cost, though, because we've had to pay interest on it all these years, high interest rate. And originally, it was actually structured so the city could borrow even more money, because when I took office, the recovery plan, couldn't balance the budget and thought that it would need to borrow even more money from AMBAC to be able to have a balanced budget. Not only have we not had to borrow more money on it, but now we're looking at trying to pay it off early. And the general obligation debt is not something that could be paid off early, but this forbearance debt, the debt that we didn't pay, that we defaulted on, is something that could be paid off early. And we're going to talk about that, because that's the sort of centerpiece of our debt restructuring, which you've helped the city put together. I just wanted to give that description to folks. And then, let's talk a little bit about the other debt we have on the books, which is the stadium debt.
Sure. The stadium debt isn't a direct obligation of the city of Harrisburg. The city provides a guarantee on those bonds. Those bonds were issued by the Harrisburg Redevelopment Authority back in 2005. And since the city provides a guarantee, if revenues generated from the stadium project are not sufficient to make principal and interest payments on the debt, the city steps in to make up the difference or pay the whole thing if that's what's required. Those bonds were also insured by AMBAC, so there's the city guarantee and the insurance. As the mayor just described, the general obligation debt, you cannot pay the stadium bonds off early. And because minor league baseball stopped last year the city had to make the full annual debt service payment, which is about $650,000. It's uncertain what the city's obligation towards those debt service payments will be going forward. It's going to depend on activity on City Island there. Through 2030, principal and interest combined payments is about $6.5 million.
Yeah, and one of the things we wanted to do, and we really saw first of all, the revenue that we've gotten from the senators, as much of a joy as it is to have a minor league baseball team, has never been able to actually cover the cost of the bonds. So the taxpayers have always been subsidizing those bond payments. But it was a particularly acute this past year when we didn't have any revenue coming in, and we had to make up all of it. So we are interested in sort of getting out of that relationship and sort of turning it on its head and treating any revenue that comes in from the senators as bonus, which could go to help underwrite the general fund, but not be reliant on that revenue to pay off the bonds. And that's what we're talking about in terms of defeasing the bonds. So let me have you keep going through your next couple slides here, Dan.
Sure. On the next slide, it illustrates what the mayor just described earlier, which is what our future, the city's future debt service payments look like after the maturity of the general obligation debt. What sticks out here are those two big blue lines that go away after 2022. Total debt service, assuming that the city has to make the full payment on the stadium bonds this year, would be about $10.7 million. Looking out to 2023, after the general obligation debt is retired, the annual debt service payments would drop to $6 million. So that's $4.7 million drop off from 2022 to 2023 before, if the city just stands pat and doesn't do anything.
Keep going.
Like we described, the city and AMBAC entered into an agreement back in 2012 when it came to how the city was going to repay the bond insurance payments that AMBAC made on their behalf. AMBAC is interested in reducing its exposure to the city. That means any risk associated with the city not making good on their payments. And the city is obviously interested in its alternatives in terms of reducing its debt load at a discount if possible. So the two parties have been in negotiations for quite some time and reached an agreement that is working its way through the appropriate approval processes right now. The agreement includes the city defeasing the stadium bond debt that we just talked about. A defeasance means that the city would make a deposit into an account that is dedicated towards paying all the principal and interest on the stadium bonds through its 2030 maturity. So it would be a lump sum payment. In return for that, AMBAC would reduce the forbearance liability, which is now getting up to $25 million and accruing interest at a very high rate, by $1.9 million. So just for defeasing the bonds, there's almost a $2 million reduction in that forbearance liability. In addition, the city would have the right to prepay the forbearance liability up to $4 million and receive an additional benefit for it. The city can repay the entire forbearance liability in a whole anytime it wants to on existing terms. But as part of this agreement, for any prepayment up to $4 million, the city will receive a credit of 38% towards the forbearance liability. That means for every $1 million that the city repays towards AMBAC, they'll get a $380,000 credit. That would be any prepayment made on the date of the execution of the stadium deal. If the city cannot or does, for whatever reason, chooses not to make all $4 million of the prepayment on that initial date, they can make a prepayment for any time for a year after that and receive a 30% credit. So if there, for some reason, is a concern about fund balance, or if we get into next year and the recovery isn't as strong as anticipated, and the city's revenues are lagging a little bit, or if there's any sort of budget reason not to make a full payment, there's some flexibility to make that payment over another year and still get a benefit for that prepayment. In addition, AMBAC will agree to reduce the interest rate on that forbearance liability to 5% instead of 6.75% for a period of 3 years, just temporarily, then it kicks back up. This deal, as the city has it planned out, there's a few different ways to address the $4 million prepayment. But the way that the city has it planned out would result in about $4.3 million of present value savings and over $12 million of actual gross cash flow savings. The present value savings are lower. We can see in the following slide. It's probably easier to illustrate there. We talked about a large upfront payment. The defeasance would require an upfront outlay of $5.75 million about. And the city, in its 2021 budget, includes a $2 million prepayment towards the forbearance liability. So not that full $4 million right away, but half of it. And I want to also make the point that there isn't a minimum that's required to be prepaid towards the forbearance liability up front. If the city gets to the point where the city has to execute, and there is some sort of reason to maintain the cash, the city still has a full year to take advantage of the benefit offered by this deal.
Hey, Dan, I think that was really helpful. Let me try and put it in terms that may be easier for people to understand. Let's say you at home, you've got 2 credit cards, and you have run your debt up. Really, you've maxed both of them out. They just so happen to be issued by the same company, but somehow you got 2, and you're making your minimum payments. But it's you know, that's it. And these cards are taking up a lot of your salary and a lot of the income that's coming into your family. You want to do something about it. Now, you'd saved up some money, and maybe you were thinking about taking a vacation, but you know, COVID's hit, so you're canceling your vacation, and you actually have enough money to pay off one of the 2 credit cards. But smartly, you get your financial advisor to call the credit card company, and he speaks to the credit card company and says, you know what? They were thinking about taking a vacation, but they actually have enough money to pay off the card. They will pay off this card in full, but they want to benefit from this. And the credit card company thinks to itself, boy, they are overextended in their debt, and we may not actually get this paid. So we'll listen. And they say, okay, you pay off the one card, and for every dollar you spend paying off the one card, we will reduce the other card amount. And you're like, really? You'll reduce the other card amount? Yeah, we'll reduce it by over $1.38. And on top of that, they say, you know what? For every dollar you spend, we'll reduce it by $1.38. But we'll also, if you could spend a little bit more money and you pay a little bit more down on the other credit card, you don't have to pay the whole thing, but a little bit more down, we'll also give you, $1.38 for that. And you say to yourself, wow, what an amazing deal. All right, that sounds great. And that's essentially what the city's negotiated. So now we've paid off the one credit card. We're going to, this is what we're proposing. And then suddenly the balance on the other credit card is really reduced. But then on top of that, you're still paying a pretty high rate on that credit card, that second credit card that's still out there. And you realize, you know what? I can go to another bank and I can get a lower interest credit card to pay off that credit card. So I'm not only going to get the value of the savings, by paying off that first credit card applied to the second credit card, but if I transfer it to a lower credit card, I'll save even more money. And believe it or not, that is essentially the deal which we've been able to work out. So look at how it works on a municipal level by going to the next slide. And Dan, why don't you walk us through that?
All right, a lot of numbers here. And the mayor is doing a very good job at giving a straightforward explanation to what I already tried to simplify. But all right, on the left side of this chart is the what the city would pay under existing conditions. If the city doesn't do anything, these are the annual debt service payments towards that forbearance liability and the stadium bonds, and the total combined. On the right set of numbers is the plan that involves defeasing the debt. That's that 5.75 million. $2 million towards the forbearance liability in 2021, and another $2 million cash outlay in 2022. The column on the far right illustrates the annual cash flow impact. So obviously, it's a large upfront payment in 2021, but significant savings beginning in 2023, but really kicking in after the forbearance liability is all paid off in 2029.
Those are incredible. They're staggering numbers. It's millions of dollars in savings for the taxpayers. Dan, why would a company like AMBAC want to offer that type of a deal if people are asking that question?
They are interested in reducing their exposure. They have liability. They have commitments out there in the form of the insurance still on the 1997 general obligation debt to the city in the stadium bonds. There's a risk that something may go wrong in the future for the city with a forbearance liability. So if they can reduce their exposure and also get some cash up front, which they're likely interested in, it makes sense from their perspective to negotiate with the city.
Yeah, and I think that's key to remember. And we also have to remember that, a big company like AMBAC, it's insuring all sorts of municipal debt all throughout the country. And we just talked about at the beginning of the show how all these situations are different, and we have many, many different sectors deeply affected, and making it hard to, potentially hard to make those payments. So if you can get cash in where you can get it, and get out of some of your holdings and de-risk your overall portfolio, you're going to want to do that from their perspective. And I think we have to be appreciative and thankful of them for working with us on this, and for you for helping put together such a proposal. I think we need to get to some questions from the public, but I'm going to just let you show your final slide there, or at least the bar graph slide, and just can you summarize here at the end, what this basically would mean as we move forward with the city.
Move down one more.
Keep going. Yeah.
There we go. This, as we started at the top of the program, the 2021 budget was put together with a multi-year perspective in mind. And there is a large cash outlay involving 2021 and use of fund balance. What this chart is showing is that in 2021 and 2022, expenses will exceed operating revenues, and the gap will be closed by fund balance, available, the savings account, essentially, as the mayor described it earlier. But this fund balance isn't being used to keep the lights on. The fund balance is being used primarily to pay down debt and pave the way for longer term budgetary savings. So after 2022, when the general obligation debt that we looked at in the previous slide is matured, there'll be a significant reduction in annual debt service and overall expenses. If the city is able to execute this debt restructuring plan, there will be more savings, and that will set the city on a course to achieve operating surpluses and rebuild fund balances to well above its stated fund balance policy of 5%, and really probably stay above 10%, which is another goal of the city. So this is the multi-year perspective we were talking about. Getting through 2022 with investments, using your fund balance for investments, and setting the course for surpluses in the outer years.
Thanks, Dave. That's a great slide to end on, and I'll let it sink in with people. The other nice thing about the slide is if you put 2025 on there, 2026, 2027, that graph is going to continue to look more or less the same and continue to slowly rise. And prior to the extension of the taxing authority, there would have been a huge, break at the end of that graph. And so we've essentially been able to, by managing the budget well and by accumulating a large savings, weather the storm of this COVID crisis, which is still ongoing, but then allow for additional investment in debt restructuring and other initiatives, which will set us on a course for, I think, a very sustainable, long-term, and positive financial future for the city. And that's why all this is an exciting moment. That's why we spent over an hour discussing it, because it's really important stuff. It's a critical moment for the city. I hope people will tune in for the budget hearings and conversations. I hope they'll send questions, and as well, I'll be answering a lot of city council's questions next week. So will the department directors. And I know this was heavy stuff, and Dan did a great job of sort of giving an excellent summary of what's going on. But do we have comments from any of our viewers?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And a reminder, public comment at harrisburgpa.gov for that next week.
Yes, and also maybe you don't have a thought now, or you're going to watch the video later, send it to somebody. Whatever questions this generated now would be appropriate to send to the public comment email, because then they will get read into the record as part of the budget hearings.
All right. We have a few questions here. I'll kind of bounce back and forth. There's two that are related about penalties. So Daniel asks, what is the status of uncollected current year real estate taxes? Looks like a penalty period collections are under the 2020 budgeted. If I'm reading that correctly. Looks like penalty period collections are under 2020 budgeted.
Dan, can you talk at all about the current status of the real estate tax and where we are in terms of the penalty period?
Penalty period was those collections are a little bit behind, but I think the flat period was just extended through the end of the year.
Yes.
The flat period revenues are way above normal, and penalty is below, just because of the difference in the timing adjustments and then the policy related to give some COVID relief.
Right. We basically eliminated the penalty period for as a COVID measure. That may be accounting for what the questioner is asking. If that's not clear, that would probably explain the biggest difference. If that's not clear, we'll try and put a follow up on Facebook, and we'll try and answer it in more depth this week.
Okay. Next question is about the early payments. Are we or are we not getting penalized for early payment? Isn't the total payment to AMBAC 7.75? And how or can we negotiate the interest down from 5%?
Well, I'll let Dan answer that. We're certainly not being penalized for early payment. That's where we're receiving the multiplier and the bonus. And while 5% may seem high, it's definitely a reduction, and a significant reduction, off 6.75%. So, these things are benefits to the city. But Dan, you could talk a little bit about how, those points were reached via consensus.
Sure. Well, the 7.75 is a combination of the $2 million that would go directly to be paying down the forbearance debt, and the 5.75 that would be used to defease the stadium bonds. I mentioned in the presentation that the total principal and interest on the stadium bonds is actually $6.5 million. So why is it only $5.75 million that the city will have to come up with? There is a debt service reserve fund of about $658,000 or so that is being held by a trustee for the benefit of the stadium bondholders, that can be used to help defease the bonds when it comes time to execute. So even that's another benefit of addressing the stadium bonds, is that we can utilize that debt service reserve money essentially right away. I mean, technically it may not happen, mechanically it may not happen that way, but to long story longer, 5.75 for the defeasement, $2 million for the forbearance liability equals 7.75.
And the interest rate, Dan, the negotiated reduction in the interest rate?
Negotiated reduction in the interest rate was part of the back and forth between us and AMBAC on the course of the negotiations. We would love to have a lower interest rate than 5%. That's where we were able to end up with. It's definitely an improvement over 6.75%. And I think the ultimate goal now that the city's taxing powers have been extended is that we can the city can re-enter the debt markets and lower that interest rate through a brand new bond.
That's right. We're not forced to keep it at 5% for ever or go back to 6.75%. We're looking to refinance the whole thing. So it's a temporary reduction, stopgap. But I think you understood what the caller was asking, which was why were we paying more than the bonds, and that is because we're also paying towards the forbearance liability and getting a bonus for both of those payments.
Okay. Mayor, I believe we have time for one more question. This is from Rach regarding the budget approval timeline. She's concerned about how fast it was this year. Is it generally the same speed as usual this year?
Yeah, it's always this. It has been the same every year that we've done it. Council usually has 2 nights of hearings. There's a budget presentation. There's usually a week off. There's questions submitted. Then there's 2 nights of hearings, and then there's a vote. Now, there's nothing which says the council couldn't schedule more nights of hearings, but historically, that's the way they've always done it. I don't think it's accurate to say it's any different or faster this year. What I think is true is that there's an awful lot of meat this year. And a lot of significant changes that haven't always been there in past years. So if the point of the question is to say, boy, there's a lot to digest and we need time for the public to get involved, I don't disagree with that. But I say, take advantage of these hearings, see where we are after 2 nights and what will undoubtedly be, 6-7 hours of hearings, Momin? See where we are, and then if there's more, ask council for more time. We're not in a rush, certainly, and we're going to try and continue to have these conversations on platforms like Facebook and elsewhere, so that people can hear and get informed. So circulate this Facebook video. Please circulate the video which we did for the budget presentation, which is much more in depth than this and covers initiatives and spending topics more than this, which is basically just an overarching financial picture. And ask your questions. Send your questions to public comment. Get involved. It's really important that the public get involved. There's a lot of information here, but I'm doing what I can to try and bring this information to the public. So thanks for your question.
And just a reminder, youtube.com/WHBG20 will be where people can watch the hearings and the legislative session live next week.
And the budget PowerPoint presentation that we presented, that is on the website, that link?
That is also on the website. We'll remind viewers in the Facebook comments where they can.
Okay, so they can print the PowerPoint. They can watch the video. You can host your own Zoom session, as YPOC has done with the comp plan and with other things. Feel free to go to invite me, and I'll come and participate if you'd like that. Send that request to my office. But the point is, I'll do everything I can to help us have a conversation. But the budget schedule, the date it is presented, the need to ratify it in December, that's all prescribed by law and long predates where we are now. It's just that we've got so much going on at the end of this year. I want to thank you, Dan Connolly. You were terrific. This was a great conversation. I think this is our first one-on-one community conversation in a long time. We're used to having many guests and a lot, but this was we were really able to have an in-depth dialogue, and I appreciate you doing that. Stay safe in Philadelphia and be well. And to all you watching out there, I'm Mayor Eric Papenfuss. Thanks for joining us. We've only got a couple more Facebook Lives here in the year. We're working on putting them together. It's going to be interesting. We're going to review some of the major accomplishments of the past year and other things as we move forward. So keep watching. If it's Friday at noon, it's Facebook Live here with the City of Harrisburg in Community Conversations. So thanks again. Stay safe. Stay well, everybody. And we'll see you next week on Facebook Live.